7 plagues, biblical sense.
Dozens of deadly and historic wildfires continue to wreak havoc on the West Coast.
Thick smoke so hazardous, California's governor says it's like smoking 400 cigarettes a day.
This is a climate damn emergency. This is real. And it's happening. This is the perfect storm.
Families are returning to find piles of ash where their homes once stood.
There are no words. It's dumbfounding. You can't even imagine why.
But you know, it is about forest management. Please remember the words, very simple. Forest management.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Give a climate arsonist 4 more years in the White House. Why would anyone be surprised if we have more America ablaze?
The National Hurricane Center is warning of historic floods along the U.S. Gulf Coast.
The rain, which has been relentless in terms of how much it has fallen, and in sheets to where you can't even really see 200 or 300 yards in front of you.
These powerful gusts every now and then, and they are whipping up all kinds of debris.
This is the year that I kind of want to say, make it stop.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zak. Thank you for joining us for our CBSN special, A Climate in Crisis. Tonight, we're exploring 2 of the extreme events that our country is facing at the same time. To the west, there are destructive wildfires burning across 3 states. More than 5 million acres have been burned. Thick smoke caused some of the worst air quality in the world. And there's a growing chorus from scientists and lawmakers that climate change has been fueling the flames. Meanwhile, in the south, the remnants of Hurricane Sally are soaking several states. The storm made landfall near the Gulf Shores as a Category 2 hurricane, bringing torrential rain and severe flooding. It's been a busy hurricane season. Sally is a tropical cyclone this year. And in both places and everywhere in between, emergency resources have been strapped as the nation battles the coronavirus pandemic. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at how climate change is furthering such catastrophic weather events and what we can do about it. Joining me now is CBS News meteorologist and climate specialist Jeff Berardelli. We're also joined by Park Williams. He is a bioclimatologist at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Park has done extensive research on fires and climate change. And Park, I'm wondering if you can tell our viewers, what does your research say about the relationship between climate change and fires?
It says that the relationship is pretty straightforward as long as you have enough to burn. So in California's forests and throughout the forests of the rest of the West, there's plenty to burn, and so all you need is a spark, and you need the fuel to be dry enough. And as temperatures have increased due to human-caused climate change, then all else equal, the fuel is getting drier and drier. And so if it's not an extremely wet, we don't have an extremely wet winter, then record-breaking temperatures during the summertime really dry things out. And then all you need is a spark, either from lightning or from people. And long story short, forests are a lot more flammable in California and the rest of the West today than they were 30 or 40 years ago because of a background warming trend.
You know, Park, this is Jeff Berardelli here. One of the studies I find most interesting that you have done is the mega drought study, that this is one of the worst mega droughts California has seen in something like 1,200 years. Can you tell the viewers more about that?
Yeah, that study wasn't looking just at California. It was looking at all of the western United States and northern Mexico. And we used tree ring records as well as records of soil moisture in order to extend the record of Western North American soil moisture back for the last 1,200 years. And that allowed us to compare the drought conditions of the last couple decades that we all know that we've been seeing. We've seen stream flow declining. We've seen the large reservoirs decline in their storage, like Lake Mead. We've seen big bark beetle outbreaks. And of course, we've seen this huge eruption of wildfires over the last 20 years. And so the West has been in drought. We want to know, how bad has this drought been compared to other multi-decade droughts that occurred over the last millennium? And we've known from tree ring records that there were these really awful droughts called mega droughts back in the medieval period. And these droughts have always looked like mutants to us in the tree ring record, and we feared that something like this would return, but it hadn't until the last 20 years. And what we found is that over the last 20 years, soil moisture deficits, or the dryness of soil across the West, was about equal to the worst, driest 20-year periods of the last millennium. And so these nightmare droughts have begun to emerge. And so then we calculated how much of this recent drought is due to climate change and how much is due to just regular old bad luck. Of course, the mega droughts prove that you can have bad luck, just cause really bad droughts to occur. And we used climate modeling and climate observations and combined those two and found that the human-caused warming trends account for about half of the drought severity over the last 20 years, meaning that if climate change hadn't occurred, then very likely we still would have experienced drought over the last 20 years or so, but the drought would have been about half as severe.
And Park, as you've been digging into these historical records that you're finding in tree rings and nature, there are some, of course, that say that fires are natural, it's all cyclical, and there is a political debate about controlled burns. I'm wondering if we can dig in a little bit into this and talk about the issue of fire and forest management. Is this really something that is responsible, the mismanagement of these forests, like President Trump and Senator Mike Lee of Utah have claimed, for these tremendous fires that we're seeing out west?
Fire is a fascinating thing because it is really one of the ways that the atmosphere and the Earth's surface and humans all interact. And so, as I just said, if we look at the correlation between the area burned in the western U.S. forest, as well as California forest, and climate, then the relationship is very strong. The warmer years have more area burned, and over time, temperatures have warmed, and the area burned is increased as you'd expect based on this relationship. And so it's really hard to get around this correlation and the fact that warmer air is drier air. And so it logically makes sense as well that this correlation should look the way that it does. But there are a bunch of other things going on as well. About a century ago, we started getting very good at fighting fires. And when we got good at fighting fires, then what we ended up doing is putting out about 97% of the wildfires that occur across the West. Every time we successfully put out a fire, then we allow vegetation to continue growing that would have otherwise been killed and thinned out because of the fire. And so today it's true that some of our forested areas are artificially dense. There are more trees per acre than there would have been if we hadn't been fighting fire for the last century. However, when we look at the correlation between temperature and burned area, that hasn't changed over time. Temperature really statistically appears to be the dominant driver of the increase. Now, the more trees there are in the forest, then the more able forest fire is to respond to warming. If there was no forest, then warming wouldn't cause more forest fire. The more forest we have, then the more forest fire is able to respond to warming.
So, Park, I just want to make sure that that we're all absolutely clear on your point there, which is that you do believe that there's a role for controlled burns and forest management, but that it's not necessarily in contradiction with understanding what's happening in terms of climate change. Is that right?
That's right. I think that mismanagement of forests has interacted with climate change. The more trees there are in the landscape, then the more that forest fire can respond to this drying effect of warming.
So, Park, you've been studying this for a really long time. Did you expect things to get this bad? I mean, this season has been historic this quickly, and do you feel like we're seeing an acceleration of climate change?
I think that we're seeing an acceleration of forest fire because of climate change. Climate change has kind of been this train that's been moving for several decades now, and scientists decades before me were predicting that we'd start seeing big ramp-ups in forest fire. We saw ramp-ups from the 90s to the 80s. We saw ramp-ups from the first decade of the 2000s compared to the 90s, and now this last decade has started to make the previous decade look like the fires were child's play. I began looking at this about 10 years ago, and I was predicting that fires were going to get worse. But scientists have been saying this for quite a while. The relationship between the aridity of the atmosphere and temperature is clear, and the relationship between fire and the aridity of the atmosphere is clear. And unfortunately, this relationship is exponential. This is why we hear firefighters every year saying that they're seeing fire behavior unlike anything they've seen in their entire career, is because as you warm the atmosphere, then forest fire responds non-linearly, meaning that every degree of warming actually causes more forest fire than the previous degree of warming.
Park Williams, thank you for joining Jeff and me.
Thank you.
For many residents in Northern California, wildfires have become an all too familiar sight. And for some, it's a painful memory. Nearly 2 years ago, California recorded its deadliest and costliest wildfire season. Fast-moving flames wiped out the suburban town of Paradise and neighboring communities in Butte County. More than 80 people were killed and thousands of buildings were destroyed. The fire was caused by a transmission line from Pacific Gas and Electric. In June, the chief executive of the utility company pleaded guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter and 1 count of illegally setting a fire. Of the 27,000 people that lived in Paradise before the deadly fire, only about 5,000 have returned. Just last week, parts of Paradise were under an evacuation warning again. David Begnow was there the day after the fire broke out on November 8th, 2018. Here's a look back at his report.
I'm so scared right now. So terrified.
As the fast-moving wildfire ravaged Northern California, the entire city of 27,000 people was forced to evacuate.
Go!
The highways were jammed with cars. People were desperately trying to escape. This man battled burning ash and falling trees as he tried to find a way out. He's safe now, but at least 5 other people died in their vehicles, their bodies so badly burned they could not be immediately identified. Some people abandoned their vehicles and simply ran for their lives.
Come on, we need to go.
5 miles north of Paradise, Tisha Arroyo and her grandfather decided to stay behind.
You gotta get out of here. Why are you staying?
I thought I could save my house.
What?
I thought I could save my house.
They watched helplessly as their home burned.
I've been trying to get him to leave.
Yeah.
I don't want to be here.
I think this is the safest place, so.
J.T. Ford and his wife Stacy went to a nearby pasture. That's where they took refuge.
And this is everything around us. And then it all came underneath us.
I think we need to move away from this propane tank.
Yeah.
The fire roared through so quick, there was only an hour of utter panic and fear, because then everything burned out.
The flames have moved so fast here that there's not a lot the firefighters can do. Ken Pimlott is director of CAL FIRE.
That fire, from the second it started, was off to the races. It's all hands on deck to rescue people and ensure getting people out of harm's way.
And this week, the U.S. was also hit by a hurricane. Sally made landfall near Gulf Shores, Alabama, Wednesday as a Category 2 storm. Torrential rain brought severe floods to the region. Skylar Henry reports from south of Mobile, Alabama.
A limb came through and it started flooding the inside of the house.
Hurricane Sally uprooted 2 trees that came crashing into Angela Heron's home in coastal Alabama. Her 1-year-old and husband were inside.
Although our house has got to be repaired, our lives were spared. God saved us from it coming all the way through the house.
People along the Florida-Alabama border are assessing the widespread damage left behind by the slow-moving storm.
It's very emotional to talk about it.
The Category 2 hurricane made landfall near Gulf Shores, Alabama, turning roads into rivers from Florida to Alabama and shredding homes and businesses.
Sally was a record-breaking rain and flooding event.
Long lines are forming at gas stations. Sierra Butler, a mother of 2, traveled from Pensacola, Florida to Alabama to fill up.
It's horrible. You know, I even came up on the highway. The lines are extremely long all the way to the middle of the highway.
Hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses are without power.
We never thought it was going to get this bad, and, here we are.
The Florida National Guard is assisting residents, who's rescued more than 370 people stranded by floodwaters. Sally left a trail of destruction as she moved inland. This massive oak tree came down on a home in Atlanta, killing 30-year-old Gerald Crawford.
Every one of those individuals we have here worked as hard as they could to get to that person.
Forecasters expect Sally to continue moving farther north, bringing severe thunderstorms to the mid-Atlantic. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Spanish Fort, Alabama.
We're going to take a quick break, but ahead, the president has made headlines this week after dismissing climate science. We'll talk to a former climate denier about what sparked his change of heart. And a look at some of the extreme weather events that have been happening around the world. These are fires in the Amazon rainforest. Stay tuned. You're watching A Climate in Crisis on CBSN. It's not just the U.S. that's dealing with extreme climate events. Some of the worst fires on record are also burning across South America. Thousands are burning in the Amazon. Katie Watson, with our partners at the BBC, has the story.
Above the canopy, unmissable signs that the Amazon is burning. But it's on the ground where the damage has been done. This virgin forest gone forever.
This is one of dozens of fires we've seen while driving through the forest today, and this is a specially protected area. Clearly, few people are paying attention to the fact there's a fire ban that's been put in place after the international outcry that we saw last year. But you wonder what hope there is when the government says that the fires don't even exist.
For Raimundo, the fires are all too real. A cocoa producer, he shows me where the neighbouring cattle farm burnt its land a few weeks ago and nearly destroyed his livelihood.
They set fire to the fields after the decree was introduced. I don't know why they didn't comply with the law. We often ask that. They must have special contacts. They know that they can commit the crimes and they aren't afraid of anything.
Small farmers like Raimundo face powerful opposition, though. With backing from the president, the agricultural lobby is more formidable than ever. This part of Brazil has become a deforestation hotspot. Then comes the burning to make way for fields of cattle. There's nothing natural about these fires. And they keep burning. Yet Jair Bolsonaro remains defiant. He's slashed the budgets of Brazil's environmental agencies, instead putting the army in charge of protecting the rainforest. And earlier this month, he publicly called environmental NGOs a cancer.
The president has problems with democracy. He can't deal with people that have different opinions and this is really part of the democracy. In my opinion, the cancer against the future of Brazil is the government action against the environment, not the NGOs.
It's not just the Amazon, though, that's burning. Further south, the world's largest wetlands, known as the Pantanal, is also ablaze, exacerbated by the worst drought for almost half a century. It's home to rare species like jaguars. Those who have survived are badly injured. So many more didn't even stand a chance. Jair Bolsonaro sees the Amazon as a cash cow, a way for Brazilians to prosper. But the way it's going, this is what the future will be. The slow death of the world's biggest forest. And time is running out for one of the most unique places on Earth. Katie Watson, BBC News, in the Amazon.
This past summer, wildfires in the Arctic Circle once again broke records, surpassing last year's carbon dioxide emissions. Officials say the smoke plumes were so large they covered the equivalent of more than 1/3 of Canada. Fires destroyed millions of acres of land, and carbon emissions spiked 187 megatons, up from last year. Scientists also say the region has been seeing warmer temperatures this year. In June, a small village in Siberia, which is typically one of the coldest spots on Earth, became the first place above the Arctic Circle to reach 100 degrees. At the start of the year, Australia was just emerging from its worst bushfire season on record. Thousands of homes were lost and millions of acres were burned. At least 30 people died. According to one estimate, at least 1 billion animals were killed. Australia's fire season is a regular occurrence each year, but the country's fires began earlier than usual in September 2019. According to scientists, the changing climate is at the heart of the problem. Holly Williams spoke to one scientist for 60 Minutes earlier this year who explained why the country's deadly bushfire season should be a wake-up call to the world.
2019 was the hottest and the driest year in Australia's history. So we actually saw temperature records be broken all over the country.
Joelle Gerges is a climate scientist at the Australian National University and is a lead author of an upcoming United Nations report on climate change.
This is the type of summer you might not have expected till the middle of the century based on past projections. So I think this is really redefining what it means to actually be living through a period of rapid climate change.
So you're saying you would have expected this kind of scenario that we saw this summer to happen in 2050?
Yeah, potentially middle of the century.
Are you shocked?
Of course I'm shocked.
Gerges says Australia is more vulnerable to climate change than any other developed nation, in part because it's the driest inhabited continent.
When it comes to climate change, is Australia a bellwether for the rest of the world?
I think this summer has been a real wake-up call for most Australians. And myself as a climate scientist, seeing the extreme level of heat and the bushfires and the drought conditions playing out so catastrophically has been, I think, a wake-up call to the world.
There is another warning that our planet is in danger. Scientists are calling for action on climate change after a massive piece of the Arctic's largest remaining ice shelf broke off. Ian Lee has the details.
Before long, much of this could be gone. Scientists say polar glaciers are shrinking at an alarming rate. The latest section in Greenland, where a 44 square mile chunk, twice the size of Manhattan, broke off from the largest remaining Arctic ice shelf.
It's really time we stop hitting the snooze button and wake up to the climate emergency.
The atmosphere in the region has warmed more than 5 degrees in the last 40 years. Those high temperatures form pools of water on the glaciers, which pushes down into cracks and weakens the ice from underneath. Scientists say old climate models are now obsolete.
The climate in the Arctic is changing dramatically and rapidly, and it's changing so fast that it's transitioning to a new climate, where the new climate can't be predicted by the recent past.
Melting Arctic ice means ocean levels and ocean temperatures increase around the globe. We've heard the warnings before, but scientists say they'll keep ringing alarm bells until changes are made.
We need to curb climate emissions right now, immediately, and we need to create a network of ocean sanctuaries covering at least a third of the blue planet if we are to take climate crisis seriously.
If not taken seriously, scientists predict the Arctic could be ice-free in the next 20 years. Ian Lee, CBS News, London.
On Monday, President Trump made a rare appearance on the West Coast as wildfires continue to ravage much of California and parts of Oregon and Washington state. But during a roundtable in Sacramento, he pushed back on climate science. Here's that exchange.
We want to work with you to really recognize the changing climate and what it means to our forests and actually work together with that science. That science is going to be key, because if we ignore that science and sort of put our head in the sand and think it's all about vegetation management, we're not going to succeed together protecting Californians.
Okay. It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Hey, well, I don't think science knows, actually.
For more on the subject of climate change denial, I want to bring back in our Jeff Berardelli. And we're also joined by Jerry Taylor, the president and co-founder of the Niskanen Center. It's a DC-based think tank advocating for immigration reform, civil liberties, and environmentalism. Jerry, good to have you with us as well. You've been called a climate convert. For 23 years with the Cato Institute, you supported projects that raised doubts about climate change. You even said that you were a, quote, convinced champion of the idea that climate change is an overblown problem. I have to ask you, Jerry, what changed your mind and what is your message now?
Well, the epiphany didn't occur immediately, but it was a process of time. The argument that climate change is an overwrought concern and the likely outcome from loading up the atmosphere with greenhouse gas emissions would be at the low end of the distribution of possible outcomes, that became impossible to hold on to as more and more scientific evidence came in with regards to the warming and how we're likely to see the more high-end scenarios play out. And then the argument for not acting because it costs more to get rid of fossil fuels and replace them with low carbon energy than to let warming play out. Well, that didn't hold up either, largely because there's been an absolute collapse in the price of low carbon energy. And we don't need fossil fuels to run the global economy. And the costs of transition are only a fraction of what they used to be back when I was at the Cato Institute. And then finally, there's the argument that finally appealed to me at the end, and probably should have appealed to me back in the day when I was a climate skeptic, which is that we shouldn't be having a white-hot debate about the most likely outcome from climate change, because that's not what risk management is about. Risk management is about looking at the full distribution of possible outcomes from climate change and weighing them accordingly. And if you look at them, sure, some of the scenarios suggest that it might be more modest an event than we fear, and that's always possible. But it's also quite possible that it's going to be an extremely cataclysmic event. And in fact, the possibility that that's what we have in store for our future is becoming more and more abundantly clear as we watch extreme weather events play out and the warming play out at a more dramatic pace than we had anticipated. And if we look at that full distribution of possible outcomes from climate change, it's insane to play dice with the planet like that and to ignore the real risks that we're facing today and that our kids and grandchildren will face.
Quite a radical transformation.
Hey, Jerry. Hey, Jerry, I have a question for you. Jeff Berardelli here. Yeah, so, I think people will be surprised at the billions of dollars, or at least multi-millions of dollars, hundreds of millions that are spent on climate denial, organizations kind of spreading disinformation. So can you give me an idea of what the tactics are? And also, why are they doing it? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, there's two things to keep in mind about the climate denial community that I used to traffic with. First, there are very few climate scientists in that community. It's mostly communicators. Their job is to win debates and to score rhetorical points when put up against scientists who may not be the best communicators. So it suggests they have a much stronger position than they actually have. But second, the more important thing to keep in mind is that most climate skeptics / climate denialists aren't in the business of talking to you or me or mainstream America. They're in the business of talking to the hard right of the Republican Party and cementing climate denialism into the identity of conservative America. In other words, to make the case that you can't be a conservative if you accept mainstream climate science. And if you want to do something about the risks with regards to climate change, you are embracing socialism. And to make this a part of right-wing tribal identity. It wasn't that way when I started at the Cato Institute in 1991, but it has become that today. And that's because of the hard work of the climate skeptic community. I mean, it used to be Newt Gingrich would go on national television and talk about the fact that climate change is real and we had to do something about it. He sat on a sofa with Nancy Pelosi in a TV ad calling for a cap and trade bill. I mean, it wasn't always the case that the right wing of the Republican Party was so hostile to mainstream climate science. But that is the fruits of what the climate denialist community have accomplished over the course of time.
Well, Jerry, as we saw, President Trump this week said, quote, "I don't think science knows." He's called climate change a hoax and says it has nothing to do with the fires in the West. What's your message to the president and others who continue to espouse these beliefs?
If you look at the 11,000 or so peer-reviewed essays that have been published on climate change over the course of the past couple of decades, you'll find all 11 papers that hold the position the president offered. I mean, to be skeptical of climate science today is to be skeptical of the Pythagorean theorem and to say, well, it's just a theory. Well, if the mainstream climate science is as far off as Donald Trump argues, then mainstream atmospheric physics is premised on a whole bunch of hooey. I mean, we know that if we put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it'll warm the planet. And if that doesn't follow, then everything we know about physics is in question.
Jerry, you have a tremendous amount of insight to what's going on the right and amongst libertarians as well. So do you see a path forward? Is there a way for Democrats and Republicans and independents to come together on climate policy?
I think so. I think there's three promising avenues for thinking that the conservative movement might come around to this. First of all, the Republican Party has always been the party of business. It's nothing else if not that. It's been a lot of things over time, but that's been the common denominator. Well, the fossil fuel industry is rapidly disappearing and it's being replaced with green energy. When the time comes that the green energy community dominates the energy sector, you're going to start seeing a lot of Republicans talking like Al Gore, right? Because that's in their interest. This is a business now that they are going to be interested in supporting. So that's, in the long run, I think the evolution of the business community is going to bring the GOP along. may not be quick enough, but it's still, I think, something to keep an eye on. Secondly, the Republican Party is increasingly incapable of competing in suburban America today. And if you want to appeal to that vote, coming clean on climate change and losing the denialism is probably a pretty good idea. It's a heck of a signal that you're not part of the old GOP if you want to compete for the college-educated votes that you're bleeding out today. And then finally, I think the COVID-19 experience is a wake-up call. Climate change is the same thing we're going through this pandemic, except it's occurring in slow motion. And there is no vaccine for it. There is only mitigation. So I think the price we pay when we ignore science, when we ignore experts, we ignore the things we can see with our own eyes around us on a daily basis, and to believe things we wish were true rather than what are objectively true. Well, we know the wages we pay when we go down that road. We're paying them right now this summer and fall because of the pandemic. And we're also seeing it play out today right in front of our very eyes in California and Australia, with the hurricanes becoming more intense, with the polar melt becoming, at this point now, something that is off the charts and ahistorical. I think that America, one of the consequences of the COVID-19 panic is that we're going to wake up from a bit of this and take climate science a bit more seriously.
Jerry Taylor, I have to say, as somebody who previously espoused some of these climate denial theories and now issuing these climate warnings, it has been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you for joining Jeff and me.
Thanks for having me, Lana. Thank you, Jeff.
With wildfires burning across the West and hurricanes slamming into the southern coast, climate change has erupted on the national stage. Much of the country is wondering how we'll move forward with that debate. Earlier, Jeff Berardelli spoke with co-founder and executive director of the Sunrise Movement, Varshini Prakash. Let's take a listen to their conversation.
I think it's important to kind of address the elephant in the room, is the coal workers, the fossil fuel workers. Let's talk about a just transition, and I'd also like to talk about environmental justice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the most important things we have to talk about when we're moving off of fossil fuels and towards a renewable energy economy. We have to ensure that no person and no worker particularly is left behind in this transition. This means that we have got to have workers at the table when we're designing these policies. We've got to ensure that any worker that is displaced has a shot has the support from the government to ensure that they have their pensions, that they have health benefits, that they have their housing secured, and we can't do what many coal corporations and fossil fuel industries are doing of actually leaving workers out in the cold when their industries fail or when profits dry up. And so I think the biggest thing to do here is to make sure that a just transition is a core element and part of any Green New Deal, and essentially to make sure that justice, making sure that equality for all is inherent in any plan to address the climate crisis, whether that is ending environmental racism or ending environmental classism. We've got to ensure that this period of economic prosperity that could come in tackling the climate crisis includes the most marginalized among us in that process.
I want to talk a little bit about the election. I understand that you have had at least some hand in shaping, kind of forming Joe Biden's climate plan. So first of all, are you satisfied with the plan? And what are your priorities going forward if Joe Biden does get elected?
Yeah. So I was a part of a Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden unity task force that was a series of 6 different task forces that came together on a variety of different policies, areas. Climate was one of them. And I worked with, 7 other members of this task force to figure out ways that we could make Joe Biden's climate plan more ambitious than it currently was. So we were able to actually push his campaign to set benchmarks around decarbonizing our economy by 2035 instead of by 2050. We pushed them to increase their investment levels from a $1.7 trillion plan over 10 years to a $2 trillion plan over 4 years, and to dedicate 40% of that investment specifically towards low-income communities and communities of color. So I'm really excited about some of those provisions. I would describe it as, Joe Biden's plan isn't everything, but it isn't nothing at all. And I think if we actually if Joe Biden wins in November, and he is able to make good on many of his campaign promises, that will present a seismic shift in climate policy at the federal level than anything that we have seen in the last 40 years.
Varshini, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Our discussion continues at cbsnews.com/climate crisis. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lana Zak on behalf of Jeff Berardelli and all of us here. You've been watching our CBSN special, A Climate in Crisis. Thank you. We're going to take a quick break now, but we'll be right back with the rest of our day's news. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.